All right, here we go. Good morning, everyone. Welcome to webinar number 16. Today we're going to be touching cyanobacteria. Our guest for today is Dr. Orren Scheider from Aclarity. You might remember him from last week where we went over some of 1,4-dioxane. While we focus on cyanobacteria, I actually had one of the interesting dilemmas as to what we were going to label this. You know, you've got cyanobacteria, you've got cyanotoxins, we've got blue-green algae, we've got algae blooms, right? All of these are things that are coming up. And as part of our emerging contaminant month, which I have since been corrected to, contaminants of emerging concern, we're taking a look at all of them, right? So if this is your first time with us, welcome. If you've been here before, welcome back. Thank you, Eddie, I know that this is the first time you've been with us. So this is part of a multiple web series that we have here at AWC. We're touching a lot of different areas, contaminants, technologies. If you haven't been able to log into any of these, it's now on YouTube. You can go and take a look at them. They're all short, what I say, bite-sized brownies where you can go through them all. We picked October to be our emerging contaminant month simply because there were four very specific ones we wanted to zero in on. And one of the reasons why I actually picked cyanobacteria is it's making it to the news quite a bit more. Now, it doesn't mean that it hasn't been there. Like we discussed with Orren, it's been there for millennia. And it's just some of the, temperature and nutrients, and without getting ahead of what it is coming about and the algae blooms that you're getting at. We actually have pilot plants out there now, a few hours from us, where we're trying to identify what's the best way of treating it. I've always seen it kind of like the chicken or the egg. Do you go after the nutrients? Do you go after the cyanobacteria? Do you go after the cyanotoxins, right? So it's all kind of identifying where you're going to be picking it up. So to give you some idea, this is, oh, here we go. These loaded kind of weird. So, you've got beaches that are closing down in Vermont. You've got dogs that are dying in Texas. And all this is all primarily coming off of either cyanobacteria or cyanotoxins. We have Lake Erie coming up. And, whoa, that really loaded wrong. Sorry about that. So in Botswana, for example, in Africa, there was close to 300 elephants that died, mysteriously died. All showed up dead. And, of course, they all were around watering holes. So the first thing that you point at is water. So, when I saw that in the news, the first thing I said is there's got to be something to do with cyanobacteria or cyanotoxins. Interesting enough, we're looking at temperature, and, we know that Africa is very warm. So what are some of the other factors that come into play? And it's not just affecting mammals, which is one of the reasons why we're looking at this. In Australia, we've got fish just because of the nature of how cyanobacteria or blue algae blooms affect the water. And we'll go into that a little bit more. Here we have them in, Vietnam. This one was in Great Lakes. We've got another one in Florida, right? So it is something that's coming up a lot, and it's one of the reasons why I wanted to touch on that. So I won't go into this. We're going to let a little bit for Dr. Scheider to take it away. If you haven't heard from us, or if this is your first time logging in, we are AWC Solutions. We design and manufacture water treatment plants. We've been around for 40 years. We've got close to 600 plants in operation. We're in the middle of commissioning plants anywhere from Alberta to Florida to Ohio, with a few other projects worldwide. We separate our plants into three. We've got everything that has to do with potable water. We do wastewater, and then we also go into skid-mounted systems. When we deal with cyanobacteria, there will be a little different configuration, and we will be touching that at a later date. But with all of that, we're going to focus on cyanotoxins and cyanobacteria today. So, Dr. Scheider, take it away.
Okay, thank you, Alex. Let me just get my screen up here. Let me go back one slide here. There we go. I'd like to talk about the 5 things you need to know. What are cyanobacteria? People call them blue-green algae. They're not algae. They're much bacteria. Where they come from, what are the health concerns around them, what regulations are out there, and just really very quickly touching on how you treat them. And as Alex said, do you treat the nutrients? Do you treat the toxins? Do you treat the blooms? Do you treat the lakes? And I'll bring up some options there. So cyanobacteria are they're pretty incredible organisms. They're very highly evolved to optimize food gathering, food being both light and nutrients. Um, what is really interesting about them is the cyanobacteria have gas vacuoles inside their bodies that they can inflate or deflate at will to adjust their buoyancy so that they can pick the correct spot in the water column to gather light. So you'll see them rise up during the morning and into the afternoon hours, and then sink back down. And we think of toxins as something, from our perspective, they're deadly. But really, the toxins are part of the cyanobacteria strategy to outcompete other algae, other larger, higher order, to gather nutrients that they need. They grow incredibly slowly, so they need to be very efficient at how they gather the nutrients. So where do they come from? First of all, they're naturally occurring. We call them blue-green algae again. They're not algae. We don't really know why the toxin gene switches on. What causes that? Why some blooms you can have very high concentrations of the cyanobacteria, but there isn't toxin production, while in other cases with low numbers you do have toxins. So it's still a scientific mystery that we're trying to figure out. What we do know, some of the things that causes blooms are high levels of nutrients, especially phosphorus. Most of the U.S., the waters are phosphate limiting. So if we put phosphate in, whether that's from wastewater or fertilizers, that increases the growth potential. High water temperatures, so we see them in the summer, not the winter. Abundant sunlight and stagnant conditions. You don't find cyanobacterial blooms in fast-running rivers. In a couple years ago, there was a bloom on the Ohio River, but in sections where it was really very slow moving. And then large lakes, oceans, even small reservoirs. This is a satellite picture from Lake Erie, and you can just see just how much algae and cyanobacteria are out there in the lake. So now, why has it become, in the last 20, 25 years, why has this grown into our consciousness? Essentially, we've thrown our ecosystems out of balance. Climate change, the heat, sunlight patterns, rain patterns have all become altered, and those favor the cyanobacterial growth. Excessive nutrients, runoff, non-point sources are all very important. And so this is why we're starting to see this. It's a harbinger, and it was one of the first really, indicators of climate change that I think the public, became aware of. What are the toxins? There are dozens of different genera that produce toxins. We have two main classes, cyclic peptides, and altogether there are over 100 different toxin molecules. The image on the top is microcystin LR, which is the most commonly found, and I believe it's also the most toxic microcystin. And on the edge here, you see this ADDA group. That's a specific chemical group that is common to all microcystins. The other portions of it change, and I think there are 60 or 70 different cogeners of microcystins. And then the bottom, other common one, cylindrospermopsin. So these are highly complex molecules. The health concerns, you name it. I mean, some of these toxins are among the most toxic compounds found in nature. Microcystins cause a variety of symptoms, blistering, vomiting, nausea, skin irritation, all the way up to pneumonia and death. Anatoxin A uses acute neurotoxicity, and it interrupts the signaling mechanism between cells. And so you get this in you, and within minutes, you'll end up in respiratory failure. And that's what happened to, in some of the cases with the dogs, very rapid death. Cylindrospermopsin causes kidney and liver damage and causes the cells to die, leading to renal failure and liver failure. And saxitoxin, paralytic shellfish poisoning, is out there. This is, one of the most potent toxins out there. So exposure to these, and you can find multiple toxins within the same bloom, depending on the type of cyanobacteria that were present. And this little image shows, what the different toxins can do. As Alex mentioned, there's a whole, it's not just human health, it's environmental health. The fish kills being a huge issue, wildlife deaths, cattle, elephants, dogs, other, livestock have all been affected. And then there's a big economic component, not just from the value of the fisheries, but just recreation. Lake Erie, marinas had to close down for months. Lake Okeechobee in Florida, even here where I am in New Jersey last summer, there were, the largest lake in the state's recreational use had to be shut down for months on end. So not just an impact on water supplies, but on other people's livelihoods too. As is the current state of politics in the U.S., there have been no regulations promulgated. A bunch of years ago, they put out health guidance levels. These are non-enforceable, but they've become de facto regulations. These are what most states have pushed for. And it really is at the state level now, and in Canada at the provincial level, although there are a little, Health Canada does have a regulatory of 1.5 ppb for total microresistance. The U.S. levels are lower for microresistance, 0.3, 0.7 for cylindrospermopsin, and only a relatively few number of states have action levels for anatoxin A and saxitoxin, and those vary among those states. It is the toxins are on the CCR, the contaminant candidate list, CCL, excuse me. And it's a thing that EPA is looking at closely, but still the states are moving faster on it. And then what are the alternatives? The best one, but also the hardest, is get the nutrients out of the watersheds. If you have control over your watershed, that may be possible. If your water utility is located on a river that goes between multiple states, that's going to be a lot harder to accomplish. For reservoirs, you can put in things like floating reeds or other biocontrols to suck up the nutrients to prevent them from being available to the cyanobacteria. And then as a chemical control, you can add either alum or a material called Phoslock, which is a modified bentonite clay, and those will sorb, especially the phosphate, and remove them from the water column and sink to the bottom. We can manipulate the lake, in some cases, and they're really limnological experts who can do this, where we can introduce aeration or mixing controls to adjust the aeration content of the water, the DO levels, and also to prevent possible release of nutrients from sediments. And then there are hydraulic controls we can do, curtain walls and other controls that might allow colder water to remain in the reservoir longer. Cold water, cyanobacteria really don't like, so the longer you can keep the cold water around, the less likely it is to grow. And also diatoms like the cold water, and diatoms more efficient gatherers of the nutrients, so those can outcompete the cyanobacteria. Then you can treat the bloom. You got to be really careful about this. Some of these, especially with the copper compounds, you can actually lyse the cells and release the toxins. So before you do this, you got to be very, very careful with that. But it does. It's a prophylactic. It's not a prophylactic measure. It's a responsive measure. And you can typically only treat a couple times a year. And you also run into the possibility of doing this many years of creating copper resistance, which then makes it non-viable for the future. There are a number of ultrasonic devices. I particularly like the LG Sonic. You can tune the frequency with them, and it does a very effective job at controlling the blooms. I've done the first large-scale study of these in the U.S. a number of years ago, and there are a lot more out there now and effective. And finally, you can treat the toxins. This is usually kind of your last resort. It's the, I don't want to say the easiest to do, but you know, it can be done pretty readily in treatment plants. Luckily, the toxins are susceptible to oxidation, either through chlorine, permanganate, or ozone. The American Water Works Association has a free version of the Hazen-Williams model, which helps determine the dosing that you need to control the toxins. Activated carbon is also great. You can use powdered carbon on an as-needed basis. GAC is also effective, although you know, you're running into other issues with coadsorption of natural organic matter. There's some evidence out there on biological carbon that works well with some of the toxins, although not all have been studied. And then there's also sorption with specialized materials. There was a small company out of Ohio that made a silica-based that binded irreversibly to the ADDA group in the microsystems. Unfortunately, they haven't really commercialized that, but you know, things are out there. And then finally, I'd be remiss if I didn't mention Aclarity. We do electrochemical oxidation, and we create a variety of different oxidants, including chlorine, ozone, chlorine dioxide, and others, which are very effective against the toxins. So with that, you know, this was just really a brief overview. We can get a lot more treatment and stuff later on in a future webinar. So I'd like to thank you for the opportunity, Alex, and we'll just open it up for questions.
Thank you, Orren. So like I promised, we make sure that we keep us on schedule. We're hitting the 19-minute mark here. But what we can do is we can open it for questions. Don't be and turn on your camera, and don't forget your mic. Ask any questions that you have as far as the cyanobacteria or cyanotoxins. If you want to punch it into the chat, you can do that as well. To get things started, I'm going to come up with a couple of questions that I had first. So here it goes. Question number one was, we are looking at the two ideal ways for cyanobacteria to grow, of course, or these algae blooms, is we know that there's nutrients in water temperature. Water temperature is kind of out of our control. So on the nutrient level, or like you mentioned, phosphates and sulfates, are we better off treating them in the stream, or is there something that there's government regulations as far as phosphate discharge? I guess it's kind of a loaded question there, but.
Yeah, I mean, non-point source control it's a political will issue. It's very difficult to implement a watershed-wide. It's really going to take, and they're competing interests. Farmers want to be able to use fertilizer, and there's strong, you know, lobbies, agricultural lobbies, both in the U.S. And Canada. So it tends to fall to, okay, you know, it falls on the water purveyors, and they generally don't have control over their watersheds. If you have an enclosed reservoir and you can control all the land around there, yes, it is possible, and you can put in controls to limit manure runoff and other types of issues, but it's tough. Ideally, that's the place to do it, as it would also prevent the blooms from occurring and then shut down of tourism or fisheries and impact on the recreational side as opposed to just the drinking water side.
Right. Yeah, and containing some of these bodies of water would be hard to do, especially on a much larger scale level if you're looking at Lake Erie or even if you're looking off the coast of Florida. I've got a question here, question number 1 from Andrew Stevano. So he has I'm assuming that the cyanotoxins are in the dissolved form. Does this oxidation affect this state?
The toxins actually both exist, both intracellular within cells and extracellular dissolved in the water. When it is really dissolved in the water, the oxidation gets at it very readily. If it's within the cell, the oxidation can lyse the cell. And if let's say you're using low levels of chlorine, the cell lysing might exert enough demand that there's no chlorine left. So you could actually see increases in toxins in the dissolved state afterwards. So you got to make sure that you have enough oxidant. If you are going to be lysing the cells, to make sure that you also have enough around to destroy the toxins afterwards.
Okay, so we've got another question here. So what is the greater concern in terms of exposure? Is it inhalation or ingestion? So what are we looking at?
I think it's generally toxin specific. Certainly ingestion tends to be probably the worst, but inhalation can also be an issue, and then just contact. There's contact dermatitis. I don't know how much, also within the mucous membranes, there's probably some transfer there that can go on, although I'm not positive. That's why you see whenever there are blooms, it's like there'll be signs up, do not bathe, do not go in the water. None of the forms of exposure are good. Let's put it that way.
Right. So it's kind of like a dermal absorption with some of the toxins, I'd imagine. So okay.
There could be, but certainly there are some inhalation hazards, and certainly ingestion is probably going to be the worst.
Okay. Yeah, I've seen that some neurological disorders have also been covered under cyanotoxins, although there is a lot of, I guess, some research being done as to why it is that they're being released while, your cyanobacteria is actually releasing the toxins. We're not going to talk on cyanobacteria psychology here, but one of the things that was mentioned was if they come under a certain stress. So whether it's, severe temperature changes or even movements in the water or some of these centrifugal systems that are used to try to remove it, when they come under stress, they begin releasing the toxins, which is where trying to treat for the cyanobacteria on its own or the algae on its own is very hard. You're almost like you're trying to treat either the nutrients or the cyanotoxins. It's hard to kind of get it in the middle. So
yeah.
Okay. Well,
one of the interesting things, Alex, talking about that is with the ultrasonic systems. I alluded to the gas vacuoles that they can adjust their height. The ultrasonic actually causes those to pop. It doesn't destroy the cell, but it destroys their buoyancy. And so they sink to the bottom outside the photic zone where they can't reproduce. So that's one way to skin the cat there.
Right, you're inactivating it more than removing it.
Right, exactly.
Okay, excellent. Well, if we don't have any more questions, Eddie, I don't know if you have another follow-up question there. But if we don't, no, you're good? Okay. If we don't have any more questions, I want to thank everybody for joining us. We are going to have a follow-up webinar where we're going to be touching on treatment options or treatment technologies. We're going to pick 3 or 4 of them, and we're going to have a 5-minute on every single one of the technologies. We're going to be doing that later on in November. We're going to be doing primarily PFAS and cyanotoxins on the treatment side. I know it's a lot to pack into 20 minutes, but we figured we'd do a different one on the treatment. So thanks again for everybody for joining us. We're going to have another one next week where we're going to be touching about commercial rainwater harvesting. We're going to have Sean Crawford out of Virginia joining us from Rainwater Management Systems, where we're going to be touching some of the commercial larger systems. And with, well, let me double check and make sure I've got my next slide over. Of course, a final little plug there. We are publishing these on our YouTube channel. It is new and yet to be published. We're trying to get as many people to go through them as possible. I'm going to go ahead and insert a link in there. If you see it on your right-hand side, there should be a link where you can have a look at them. You will be receiving a recording of this tomorrow. And so if anybody wants to review it or if you want to share it with everyone, it's there. So thanks again, everyone, and I'll see you next week.